Howdy. I'm happy to be here. I ain't from Idaho. I started out in Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma now. But I'm living out in California. I'm in the movies. And you got to live out there if you're going to be in the movies. But I travel around a good deal. And I'm happy to be here. Shoot. I'm old enough, I'm happy enough to be almost anywhere. Boy, that was nice music. I tell you, I'm almost tempted to sing. But the people in charge of the program said they wanted to economize. So that means no singing for me. So I'll probably just talk to you for a little while. I've been talking to a friend of mine, George Lorimer. He works at the Saturday Evening Post. Mr. Lorimer asked if I would put together some notes about my life. Seems to think somebody might be interested in it. I can't imagine who. I've read a few biographies myself, although I don't read many books. And most lives are the same. They start off by saying, that so-and-so was born in such and such a place. And, well, they never say why, which I think would be more interesting. But as I've put together the notes, I've discovered why the stories end up that way, because that's where you have to start. Now, you're probably thinking already, Will's going to spend a lot of time out here. He's not going to have very much to say. That's not so. I've been traveling around the country, as I said, and I've noticed that a lot of people these days are having a hard time. A few years ago, back in the 20s, it seemed like if you had $100, you could throw it at almost anything, and it'd come back to you 3 or 4 times. The last few years have changed, and I see a lot of people who, I think they probably have a pretty hard time putting food on the table. A lot of them looking for relief. They write to the government, asking for it, and sometimes they get it. Now, I don't know how you're doing. Maybe you're doing well. But I thought I'd start off by giving you just a little bit of relief in the form of a promise. I ain't going to be up here very long. It's always been a principle of mine that a fellow ought to say what he knows and sit down. And I figure if most speakers did that, we'd all have more time to do our jobs or spend with our family. Preachers would do it. A lot of churches wouldn't have to meet but about once a month. And if politicians would do it, but that ain't going to happen. I was up in Washington just a couple of weeks ago. A lot of people say, "Well, do you write your own gags? What do you do?" And I say, "No, I don't. I don't have to worry about stuff like that. I go to Washington every once in a while, drop in and see what the boys is doing, and I just report the facts. They can do more crazy things without trying than I can think of. But I was up there visiting with a friend of mine, senator from Kansas, Capper, old Senator Capper, a friend of the farmer. Mostly writes farm journals. But we were having dinner down in the dining room, the Capitol. And I said to Capper, they're having these, what do they call them, filibusters. Somebody gets up and they speak all day and all night, and the next day they're going on and on about things. And I said to him, if you would employ this as a rule, whenever a fellow up here has said all he knows, he has to sit down. I said, I think you'd get more done. He thought about it. He said, well, that's a good idea, he said, but it won't work up here, you see, because several of these people would have to sit down right after roll call. and some of them maybe before that. But you don't have to worry about me, because all I know is what I read in the papers. And, I've been looking at the press, ever since I got to Coeur d'Alene. So you can probably tell about how long I'm going to be up here. I do love newspapers, and I write for them, I started out a number of years ago, and I've been fortunate enough to get by with saying just about whatever I want. Some of the editors I know complain about my spelling. and my grammar. But I'm not getting paid reading wages. I'm getting paid to write. So I don't pay much attention to them. Well, anyway, I started off. I was going to tell you a little bit about my life. I was born back in Indian Territory. Only person I know who was born on Election Day who will admit it. I never got elected to nothing, so it didn't help. But I was born on Papa's ranch. Papa had come to the territory a number of years before. He'd built a log cabin, and when the war came along, he went off and fought for the Confederacy. Most Cherokees did. Papa was part Cherokee. When he came back, he added on to the house. Built the addition with frame lumber, painted the whole thing white. We used to call it the White House. And that's where I was born. Now, Papa was a cowman, and so I was born out on the ranch. My sister Sally says that right before I was born, Mama said, would you carry me from the frame lumber part of the house into the log cabin? She'd been reading a biography of President Lincoln. She figured I needed all the help I could get. So I was born in a log cabin, but it didn't do no good. But anyway, that's where I started out. And Papa was part Cherokee, as I said. He was about 1/4 blood Cherokee. Mama was about 3/8 blood. And I've always figured that if I'd stayed in school a little longer, I could probably tell you what part of Indian that made me. But I can't. I'm real proud. I'm as proud, however, of my Cherokee blood as of anything. And in these days, when we recognize often, that we've not always treated the Indians fairly in our country, I'm especially proud to be part Cherokee. Back in those days, the government would give land to the Indians, They'd say, Indian, this is yours as long as the grass grows and the water flows. They never said nothing about oil. When they found oil, they came and took the land back. And they would try to redistribute it somehow. And they moved the Indians onto land where the grass wouldn't grow because the water never did flow. And they left them. But I didn't come here to complain about that. As I said, I'm proud of my Cherokee inheritance. I could tell you some stories about the history of the Indians in this country, and most of them would be sad. But the truth is that there's good reason for us to be proud. And I think in the days ahead, you will see that we'll probably reclaim this country. But anyway, I started out back there on Papa's ranch. I thought probably being a cowman was a pretty good deal. Papa and some friends would go down into Texas, round up some stray longhorn cows. They'd drive them up to the ranch, feed them out over the winter. Good blue stem grass, didn't cost him a thing. Sometimes he'd invest $1.50 a head to drive them across the Red River. Come spring, they would drive them up to St. Louis and sell them for $35 or $40 a head. Now, you can do the arithmetic. You got 2,000 head of cows. You're paying $1.50, feeding them over the winter for nothing and selling them in the spring for $40. You're going to make some money. So I figured a life like that was for me. Papa said, Will, look around you. He said, all of this country, whether you wish it or not, he says, it's going to become a state. And you want to be ready to go up with it. You need to get an education. Well, he started sending me to school. And he sent me to just about every school in the territory before it was over. But I didn't stay in any of them very long. I'd stay till we get to about McGuffey's fourth reader. We didn't really have grades, but we had readers. McGuffey's first reader and second, third, fourth. By the time we'd get to the fourth reader, I would take off. Papa'd round me up, put me back in another school. They'd say, where are you, Will? I'd say, oh, I'm in McGuffey's fourth reader. I got to where I knew the fourth reader just about as well as McGuffey. And I've always been sorry that I didn't take a chance on the fifth grade. But I was restless. Part of my trouble staying in school had to do with this little rope. There was a fellow named Dan Walker who worked for my papa. When I was just a little guy, he took me aside. He said, Will, get you a piece of rope like this, keep it in your pocket, carry it with you everywhere you go. He said, you'll always have something to do with your hands. You'll never be in trouble. Well, he was right about having something to do with my hands. And when I'd go to school, I'd take my rope. We'd go out on the playground. The other fellows would play ball, and I would too, generally, but some days I get a little restless. I'd get my rope and just go over by myself. I figured it was an opportunity to get a little practicing done, and so that's how I'd spend recess. The bell would ring. We'd go back into the classroom. The teacher would say, "Time to put your arithmetic book up on your desk." And I did. She almost always paid attention to somebody else. And I didn't think there was any reason to waste my time, so I just got my rope and went over in the corner of the room. Figured I'd get in a little more practicing. Now, some of you haven't been away from school long enough to have forgotten what teachers are like. The teacher would come over and say, "Will, I'll have the rope, thank you very much." And I would give it to her. She'd say, "I'm going to put this up in my desk. If you behave for the rest of the day, you might be able to take it home this afternoon." Well, that was generally goodbye rope. But it never bothered me very much. I just about always had a spare. And Dan had tried to teach me when I started. He said, "Will, the one thing you want to remember about these ropes," he says, "try not to ever get your neck caught in one of them." But I just almost always had enough rope to, hang myself. And so I was in and out of a lot of schools until finally Papa said, "Will, I found a place for a rascal like you. I'm sending you up to Missouri, Kemper Military Institute." Yeah, so I was at Kemper. I was there almost 2 years. I spent about a year in the guardhouse and about a year in the 4th grade. I was 17. And a friend of mine named Billy Johnson, this right in the Texas Panhandle, finally came to me one afternoon. He said, "Will, I've been watching you." He said, "I don't think you're happy here." And I said, "Well, Billy, no, I'm really not." He said, "Well, I think if I felt like I think you feel, I would take off, go out to the Panhandle where I come from." He says, "There's a fellow out there named Frank Ewing. I believe Mr. Ewing would give you a job on his ranch." Well, I thought about that. Thought about it all afternoon. And that night I took off and just quit education for good. Well, I didn't go by home and report to Papa, on the progress of my education. I went out there, met Mr. Ewing. He gave me a job, and pretty soon, a month or so later, I was involved in a cattle drive. And most of the cattle drives were all done by then, but he had about 400 head of cows that he wanted to take up to the train at Medicine Lodge. So we went. We went up across the Canadian River and the Cimarron, the Salt Fork of the Arkansas, put them on the train, started back. Took about a month, and I got paid the $25 that I was promised. I spent it on a horse. Papa had always said a fellow ought to ride his own horse if he could. So I had one. I tell you, for $25, he wasn't much of a horse. But I rode him down to Amarillo, found another ranch job, and I kicked around for a while till I got homesick. Things had changed by the time I got back out to the place at Ulaga. Papa had remarried. My mama had passed on, gone to heaven a few years before. Papa had remarried. He'd moved into town, into Claremore, started an almost inevitably corrupt life as a banker. And a politician, too. So he said, "Will, if you're not going to get an education, I'll just give you some calves, put you out on the ranch. You can be in charge out there." That worked for a little while, but I got sick. It was a sickness that I call wanderlust. You've maybe had it. I know a lot of people that get it from time to time. Wanderlust hits you right in the belly. Whenever, no matter where you are, more than anything in the whole world, you want to be somewhere else. Could be some of you got it right now. I wanted to be in South America. You see, I had been reading in magazines and papers about how it was still possible to go down there and be a gaucho or a vaquero, which is cowboy in South America. And I got a friend of mine, Dick Parris, wanted to go with me. So we took off. We was going south, so we went to New Orleans. We was looking for a boat. The boat we found was going up to New York City. So we went up there. From New York City, we found a boat that was going to London, England. And from over there, after a couple of weeks of looking around, we found a boat that was headed for Rio de Janeiro. After we spent a couple of weeks down there, Dick came to me one day. He said, "Will, I've had about all of the adventure I can stand." He says, do we have enough money to go home? And we counted our money. We had enough for one ticket. I figured I'd got Dick into this, so I gave him my part of the money. He went home. As I told you, Papa was a banker. I figured I could probably write a letter and get some money. And then when I really thought about it, I realized that what Papa would say is, well, you better get a job. So I started looking. And I was lucky enough to find a job taking care of cows and horses. But these were on a boat, and the boat was going to South Africa. So I went over there. I got off the boat, followed the cows up to Johannesburg, and saw an advertisement. It was put in the paper by a fellow named Texas Jack. He was looking for somebody who could spin a rope in his Wild West show. I figured that was me. So I signed on. He gave me a job. I was making about $20 a week. We traveled all over the country. I saved a little bit of what I had. Of course, there was an occasional card game. And by the time he got ready to come back home, I didn't have enough money to come. So he wrote me a very nice letter and said that he would give me a job if he had one, and if I'd like to look for another one, I might have it. So I've got a job with a circus. Went to Australia and New Zealand, and eventually got back to the United States. Well, when I arrived, you can imagine who was there to meet me. It was Papa. He said, Will, now that you've been around the world, I guess you're probably ready to settle down. I said, Papa, I've seen show business. I don't believe I can ever live on a ranch. Well, that didn't please him very much, but at any rate, I was lucky enough pretty soon to get a job with a friend of his, Mr. Zach Mulhall. Mulhall had a show that was, well, we went up to St. Louis first and then up to New York City. He did a show in Madison Square Garden, down on the floor of an arena that was about the size of this room. Some of us were dressed up as cowboys, some as Indians. There were cattle and horses everywhere. There was a big longhorn steer about this tall. He decided he'd rather see a show from a seat up in the second balcony. He took off for it by way of the audience. A couple of cowboys went after him, but they weren't having any luck. And so I grabbed my rope. I took off just about as fast as I could run. I got a loop going over my head, threw it out as far as I could, was lucky enough to get it over both horns, and pulled it tight just as he got to the seat he was going for. He sat down. He looked back down. And I think he decided it wasn't the seat he wanted after all, because he started back down. And when he did, I followed him, because there wasn't anything else I could do and hold on to the rope. So when he got to the bottom, there was a rail that went all the way around the bottom of the arena, and he went very gracefully over that rail. And that's what I had decided I was going to do, too. And just as I got there, the lights went out. When they came back on, I was lying in my hotel room. Yeah. My friend had a newspaper in front of my face. He said, "Look, Will, you're a hero." Sure enough, I look at the paper. There's a picture of a fellow with my shirt on. He's lying face down in the dirt. And the caption underneath the picture says, "Cowboy hero saves audience from wild cow." New Yorkers don't know the difference between a cow and a steer. It's true. But my friend said, "Will, if you're going to do that sort of stuff, you really ought to get into vaudeville while you're up here." And boy, I wanted to hear that. So pretty soon I was working, sometimes as much as a couple of $100 a week. We went to Dayton and Cincinnati and Rochester and Erie, Columbus, all the big places. And, well, I was making a little bit of money, having a good time, and then I got sick. Wasn't wanderlust. No, I was going everywhere. This was a sickness of the heart. I was in love. There was a young lady I had met a few years before, back before I took off to go to South America. Her name was Betty Blake. She was from over in Arkansas. She had family in Ulaga. That's where I met her. We had had some time to visit. We'd gotten acquainted. We did the kinds of things that young people did in those days. We went on a hayride and sang songs around the piano. Had a good time. I went on my trip. When I got back, I saw her again. It was then that I realized my life was not going to be complete until I could convince her to marry me. And I started asking. And Betty started saying no. She always knew a fool when she saw one. And so I realized that my life was maybe not going to be as easy as I thought. And it kind of reminds me, there's a rope trick that Dan had tried to teach me when I started out. And I think of it because we call it the wedding ring sometimes. And what you do is throw it up in the air, make it go around like a ring. And, of course, that's what I was trying to do, of course, was put a ring on Betty's finger. And I figured they was about as easy one as the other. So I would ask, and she'd say no. And I thought, well, Will, you're going to have to make some adjustments. Well, I was willing to make adjustments. And I would ask again. And she'd say no. Well, I said, I'll just make some more adjustments. Some of you have realized already there's a limit to how many adjustments I can make. It is a public place, after all. But I would ask, and Betty would say, "Will, I'm not really interested." And finally, I tried to get her to talk to me a little bit, and she said, "Will, the truth is, I don't want to marry somebody who's in show business." Well, that kind of took me aback because I'd spent given up a good deal to get into show business, and now to hear her say that, I didn't know what I'd think. So I did give it some thought, and after a while, I said, "Betty, maybe I can change if that's what's necessary." Sometimes I discover the gum gets in the way. So, anyway, after a while, I said, "Betty, if it's the only way I can get you to say yes, I'll give up show business." And she said yes. So on the day that we agreed, we met over in her mama's living room over in Rogers, Arkansas. We said our vows, and when we got through, I said, "Now, Betty, I want us to be happy here. I want us to live a happy life for a long time, and I believe we'll have to do that. We'll have to be honest with each other, and so I need to make a confession." I said, "I've already promised some shows up in New York City." "Well," she said, "we'll just go up there for our honeymoon. When we're done, we'll come back and settle in." So we went. We had a good time. I did the shows, and by the time I'd finished them, I'd promised some others. By the time I finished those, either Betty switched over about show business, or maybe she realized there wasn't much else I could do. At any rate, when I look back, I kind of think probably the best open performance of my life was the day I wrote Betty. And ever since then, my life's been just about perfect. We've got 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. We got what they call a ranch out in California. It doesn't cost any more to call it a ranch on the deed. And at a time when, as I said earlier, I travel around the country and see a lot of people who can't afford to put food on the table for their families. A lot of people out of work. Some papers say maybe 1 out of every 3 Americans. And I don't mean lazy out of work. Can't find a job. Time like that, I got more work to do than I've got time. I'm making movies, talking on the radio, writing for the newspapers, and making speeches like this. Well, I don't see how my life could be a whole lot better. Of course, things have changed. Life ain't the same as it was. And some of that's good, some of it's not. Now, I'm no economist. An economist, is a fellow who says, you tell him what the situation is, he can tell you exactly what's going to happen. And his guess is just as good as anybody else's too. But I'm no economist myself, but I do realize, that we're having some trouble in the country. And I think it probably has to do with the distribution of wealth. There's just as much money as there ever was. Now, a good friend of mine, Mr. Coolidge, who was president just a few years ago, gave me the best economic advice I've ever had. He said, "Will, if you want to be wealthy in this country," he said, "it's not hard. He says the thing to do is buy yourself some good stock, hold on to it until it goes up, and then sell it. If it don't go up, don't buy it. Yeah. You guys catch on. Faster you catch on, the less time we'll be here. But so I took his advice. I've never owned a share of stock. Never owned a share of stock. I'm buying real estate myself. They're not making any more of that. Stock you can print. But a lot of people say there's less money in the country than there was. I don't believe that. I think it's just gotten into fewer hands. You could take 10 Americans, you could take their money and go buy the whole world. That ain't the problem. Trouble is, we got 10 million Americans can't afford to buy breakfast in the morning. When we got a situation like that here at home, we probably need to figure out how to redistribute the wealth a little bit. Even the people in the Senate realize that. The Republicans are trying to give everybody a dime. Huey Long's trying to give them $1. Maybe it's just a difference in the generosity of the two. I don't know, but this fellow Morgenthau, Mr. Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, he's got an idea. He says, we'll impose an inheritance tax on these wealthy guys, and we'll redistribute their money. Well, it's a plan. I don't know how well it'll work, but he says we'll take these guys that are making $10 million, $15, $20, $30, $50 million, which says when they die, the government will take 90% of that, send 10% to the heirs. And these guys with a lot of money, 500 million, $1 billion, such as that, the government will just take all of that. And they'll send a letter to the heirs that says, your father died a pauper here today. He died a pauper here today, and he's being buried by the MEBA. Everything in Washington these days has got to have initials. He's being buried by the MEBA, the Millionaires Emergency Burial Association. Yeah. Now, Mr. Morgenthau says, he can tell you just how much you're going to get. 1936, 1938, so on, as long as the Democrats are in office. And that's planning. But at any rate, and Mr. J.P. Morgan, that's somebody whose estate I think the Democrats would like to get their hands on. And Mr. Morgan, I think is a normal, he's a patriotic enough fellow, but whether he'd want to just die right off, so that Morgenthau can balance his budget. I mean, that's asking a good deal of a fellow. So, at any rate, it's a plan. I don't know if it'll work, but I do think we've got to figure out a way, to not lose some of our people along the way. And that's sometimes happening. Now, there are some people who have changed our lives in some other ways and helped other people get involved in life. I think about transportation myself because I spend a lot of time traveling. How many of you rode your horse here today? You see? Well, no. We don't do that very much. But when I started school, I always rode a horse to school. Lived with my sister Sally when I was a first grader. Rode 3 miles to school and 3 miles back every day. I can still remember little Minnie, pony. But as I grew up, I'm like you. I got used to riding on the train and, riding in an automobile. Most places I go by automobile. And I enjoy that. Betty and I have got an old LaSalle. Sunday afternoons, we go out in the countryside and just sort of cruise. But Mr. Ford, has made it possible for almost everybody to have an automobile. He's a good friend of mine. I saw him a couple of years ago. We were having a birthday party for Mr. Edison up at Dearborn. And I got up there, was talking to Henry. He had the Model T, and now he's got the Model A. At the time, he just dropped the price of the Model T to $400. I said, Henry, how cheap do you think you can sell these cars? He said, well, the truth is, if I can control the sale of the parts, I can give the cars away. He says every one of them will shake off enough bolts in the first year to pay for itself. And after that, everything is just pure profit. Well, now, see, that's the kind of fellow we need in the White House. So I'm for Mr. Ford. But and I've known some other, politicians who've worked pretty hard at this. And But the real heroes of our time are the young guys, flying the airplanes across the sky. Boy, I love to fly. I mean, I'm not a pilot myself, but I've flown with a lot of these guys. In fact, sometimes I just pay postage on myself and fly with the mail planes. The world is so beautiful from up in the air. Of course, you don't always know where you are. And so some time ago, I made a proposal in my column. I said if the Lions or the Rotary or the Kiwanis or whatever would get together in all the towns across the country and do the work, I said, my idea is you take the biggest building in town and paint the name of the town on top of the building. I thought it was such a good idea, I offered to buy the paint. Well, I tell you, I underestimated the size of the country. I started to get letters from everywhere. And generally, I would get letters from places like Oklahoma City or Tonganoxie, Kansas, or Sacramento, or San Francisco. And I finally had to write another column. I said, I'm going to have to change my promise. I said, I can't afford all the paint. I'll pay for towns like Ada and Hugo. Up to 4 letters, I'm good. I said, after that, I think maybe the folks are going to have to get together and raise a little money for the paint, too. But I still think it's a good idea. Well, anyway, I love to fly. Now, when I go back home to Oklahoma, a lot of times my friend Wiley Post come up. He'll land up at Oologah on the ranch. We'll take off. We'll fly over to Bartlesville and have breakfast. Down to Tulsa for coffee. Oklahoma City for lunch. Chickasha in the afternoon. Lawton for supper. The moon's out and the stars are bright in the evening. We might take off and just head for Amarillo. You can't do that on a horse. Now, I don't think you could trust a fellow that didn't love a horse. But I need to get around more these days, and so I love to fly. Now, Wiley's been around the world a couple of times, set a speed record both times. Now he says he has a new plane. He'd like to go up to Alaska and cross Siberia, around the world that way. Wants to know if I'd like to go with him. Well, I've never seen Alaska, and I've heard it's real pretty. So if I can get the movie I'm making, we're working on a thing called Steamboat Round the Bend. A good friend of mine, Irvin Cobb's in it. He plays the captain of a steamboat called the Pride of Paducah, and I'm the captain of the Claremore Queen. We're racing down the Mississippi River. Of course, we're shooting a movie on the Los Angeles River, which doesn't have any water in it. But that's the movies. Anyway, if I can get the movie finished in time, I'm going to be tempted to go with Wiley. I'd like to go. Betty says, well, it's dangerous. We made a trip a couple of years ago, anniversary trip, across Siberia by train. She says, towns were 2 or 3 days apart. If you had trouble out there, it'd be a while before somebody would find you. Well, she's right about that, and maybe I'll decide not to make that part of the trip, but I think a fellow's got to go for all the adventure he can. I believe that, a friend of mine, Mr. Will Durant, asked me not too long ago, he said, Will, do you have a philosophy? And I said, imagine me having a philosophy. I said, Mr. Durant, I don't think so. But I said, here's what I think. I said, none of us is here for very long. So what you need to do is get yourself a few laughs. Do the very best you can at everything you do. Live your life so that, when you lose, you're ahead. Or I might have said, live honest. Live so that when you die, you don't have to worry about somebody selling the family parrot to the town gossip. But when my time comes, and it will, I hope what they put on my, what do they call those things? Epitaph. I hope they'll say I joked about every prominent man of my time, but I never met a man I didn't like. I'm real proud of that. Fact is, I'm so proud of it, I can hardly wait to die so it can be carved. But you come around and see me after I'm gone. I may just be sitting out there reading it. That's how proud I am. But, that's kind of what I got. And I'd be more than happy to entertain some questions if you got them. I don't know if I can answer them. But I think probably this is supposed to be an engaging kind of sport. And so if you want to engage, this would probably be the right time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And he will answer questions first as Will Rogers, and then he'll go out of character, and we'll find out who he is. Who has the first question? Feel free to ask him. He's very, very gifted, and he'll be able to tell you things that you're curious about.
It's kind of a shy audience.
The first questions always are shy, and then they kind of get encouraged from that first person. Who wishes to ask a question? Right here, we have one here, and then I'll come back there. Let's start here.
At the risk of being morbid, what was your thought when you realized you were going to die?
Well, the first time I realized it, I was on stage in New York City. After a couple of nights in vaudeville, I realized it was a thought you were going to have every night if you're going to be in show business. You just go right ahead, because that's all you can do. I mean, you realized you were going to die, didn't you? How old were you? Yeah. Well, I think it comes to us pretty soon.
Whatever happened to Mrs. Rogers?
Well, I hope she's back at the ranch. Betty's a lovely lady, and boy, I'd feel sorry for her. She's had the life's work of raising 4 children, 3 that she gave birth to and 1 she married. But she's a wonderful lady. She has more sense than her husband does, and as I've traveled around the country, I've met a number of fellows who probably would be a better husband to her than I am, but I ain't letting her matter. She takes care of our outfit, and she's raised all 3 of our children, done a fine job, and I'm holding on to her. I'm about the only person out in California that I know in the movies who's got the same wife he went out there with, and I'm not going to let her go.
Other questions? There you go.
I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your children, whether you made them go to school, and what they're doing.
Well, sure. I'm always happy to crow a little bit about the kids. And, when I tell about my own education, I'm not trying to prescribe what a fellow ought to do. It's not a good idea to get out of school like that. And I've kept my kids in school. Now, the oldest one, Will Jr., finished just a couple of years ago at Palo Alto. We went up. Mr. Hoover came out to give the consolation address, and we went up to hear him. He's working. Will Jr. is working in Fort Worth now for a good friend of mine, Mr. Carter, at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Thinks maybe he'd like to be a journalist, and would like to have enough money to buy a paper. But I tell him I think probably he needs to learn to write first. So he's doing that. And Mary, who is our middle child, Mary wants to be an actress, but she doesn't want to be an actress in the shadow of her father. So she went back east. She's been at Sarah Lawrence for the last few years and is about to finish. She does some theater work in the summers. I think she's maybe going to sign a movie contract before too long if she's lucky. But she's going to spend part of this next summer doing a play up in Maine. And part of my plan is, you see, when Wiley and I make this trip, we're going to come back to Maine, and we're going to meet the rest of the family up there. We'll all get together and see her. But that's what she's doing. Now, Jim, who's the youngest boy, he's still in college. He's traveled around a good deal. He's been looking for a college, where he could find some shoulder pads that fit him. But he hasn't been fortunate enough to do that yet. Jim's kind of the Republican of the family. He's got the first dollar he ever made, and he's a little bit like his father in another way, in that he'd just about as soon be in a saddle as anywhere else. And so he's spending part of the summer out on a place where I worked when I was a young fella, called the Mashed O. It's a ranch out close to, well, there's a place called Muleshoe, Texas. And that's where he is this summer. And working for the descendants of Mr. Halsell that I worked for. But they're all good children. And they've stayed in school, they've done well. And I think that probably life will take care of them. And I think they know
Mr.
how to-
Rogers,
Yes, ma'am.
did your father ever come to kind of appreciate your talent and accept that you were going to have the career that you did?
Well, he did. He did understand, or he did come to appreciate it some, but it took a while. For a long time, even after Betty and I married, he would say, Clem, my papa's name was Clem, Clem would write and say, come home. Says, things are happening here, and if you'll just come back home, you can be part of this. And I would write to him and say, Papa, I'm just an old country boy in the city, but I'm eating pretty regular. And I think it's because I've stayed an old country boy. And eventually I realized that he needed some demonstration of my success, so I would occasionally mail him a little money. Well, he didn't need it, but he needed to know that I could afford to send it to him. And so I did that. And then a couple of years, well, it was really less than a year, I guess, before he passed on. He came up to Washington, D.C. when I was doing a show down there. And he came to see me in the show. He did a little investigating. He came into the theater early and counted all the seats. He knew what he was paying for a ticket. And he knew what I was getting paid. And when he left, he said, well, I think you're doing okay. Well, I took that as okay. And when he got home, he talked to Sally and said, I don't think they're paying Willie enough. I think he deserves more than he's getting. So I kind of figured that probably he realized I was going to make it all right. But I think he's a little disappointed. He probably had some crazy idea that I'd go back and be governor of this new state of Oklahoma. Well, Oklahoma hadn't been around long. I think it's going to survive. We're getting even with some of the other states. We've already impeached 2 governors. But it's coming along fine. And maybe I'll eventually go back. But right now, I'm in show business. And I think Papa accepted that. As I said, he went home, and before long he was gone, which was a sad thing. But it was nice to have made peace.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers, I like to fly too, and I was just wondering when you started flying and what's your favorite airplane?
Well, that's a good question. I came to flying kind of slow. First opportunity I had, I was living in New York City working for the Ziegfeld Follies. And I went down one Sunday afternoon to the shore down in New Jersey. Paid $5, got on a plane that took off from the water, flew about 350 feet, and landed. I got off the plane. My head hurt. My stomach was upset. And I said, I ain't doing that again. And it took a little while for me to get up my courage. But a few years later, I was introduced to a fellow named Billy Mitchell. I was in Washington. He was there. He said, Will, you want to go up flying? I said, well, I don't know. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, if you'd like to go, I can take you. So we went up for a little flight. When we got down on the ground, he said, well, you know what? He said, you just went with me on the last flight that I'll ever make as a major general. He said, you're going to make me a colonel and send me somewhere else. Because they don't agree with my ideas about flying in this country. Well, that was kind of my reintroduction to flying. And then Charlie Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, made us all stand up a little prouder. So I figured it's probably a pretty wonderful place to go and a way to go. I fly in just about anything that'll go. I've been in Stearmans and Fokkers and Vegas. Wiley's little Vega, the Winnie Mae, is a pretty special plane. And he's a test pilot for Lockheed, so he's got access to these planes. And this new one he's got, he's built it out of an Orion and an Explorer. He says he thinks it'll go higher and further than anything he's ever had. But it's kind of nose heavy, he said. And that's why he wants me to go sit in the back, But at any rate, I'm willing to get up and go in just about everything because the world is just so beautiful from up in the air. You can't even describe it to somebody who hadn't been there.
Yeah,
Yes.
Bill, did Samuel Clemens have an effect on your life, and was he a friend? He was 31 years old. You were 31 when he died. I just want to know.
Well, and I was living in New York City. We never really got to know each other, but he is, without question, the most important humorist that we've ever had in this country. And I think probably the next one is going to be this fellow that I'm working with on the movie out in California, Mr. Cobb, which is handy, because then when they move the mantle from Hannibal, they won't have to move it very far, just up the river to Paducah, Kentucky. And yeah, Mr. Clemens or Mr. Twain, as he liked to be known publicly, was a fellow that all of us who think of ourselves as humorists, all of us admire him and think of ourselves, I suppose, as trying to imitate him, but I don't think any of us will ever be as good. So,
Mr. Rogers, who's your favorite politician, if there is such a thing, and why?
Well, as I said before, I like Mr. Coolidge. Mr. Coolidge has always been, he's been kind of special to me, even though he's a Republican. I'm not a member of any organized political party myself. I'm a Democrat. But if you live in the United States the last few years, you sort of had to watch, and kind of understand the Republicans because that's about all we've had. And now we've got Mr. Roosevelt, and he's a fine fellow. Mr. Roosevelt, well, talk about Mr. Coolidge just a little bit. He came into the office from the vice presidency where nothing was ever expected of him. And he looked around after he got in there, and he said, that's about right. So that's what he did for a couple of years. He came in after Mr. Harding died, so he wasn't in there the whole time. So for a couple of years, he did nothing and got reelected on it. And I think he'd have gotten reelected again in 28, except he said, I choose not to run. And so we elected Mr. Hoover, who I believe is probably the most competent politician we've ever had in Washington, the most competent fellow we've ever had as president. In fact, I'm not sure we've ever really used competence as a measure before. But the trouble with Mr. Hoover and his politics was that he tried to help people, but he didn't quite know how to reach out and help them. Everybody wanted something from him. The women wanted him to come take care of the kids, and the farmers wanted him to give them rain, and the fellas making liquor wanted him to do away with prohibition. It had been just a few years since we passed prohibition. And so like a good Republican, Mr. Hoover says, well, we'll consider that. He says, we'll appoint a committee. He knew no Republican is ever any happier than when he's on a committee or a board of trustees. So he appointed the Wickersham Commission. Old man Wickersham and some other women went out there, and they spent 2.5 years and $4 million. And when they came back to see Hoover, they said, Mr. Hoover, we've been studying the problem, and we believe there's a little bit of drinking going on. Well, now, see, I was living in New York City during part of that time, and there was about 10,000 places that you could get a drink. No questions asked, but none of them legal, of course. And so that was part of the problem with Mr. Hoover. Mr. Hoover said, well, if we can't tell for sure, there's not anything we can do about it. And so that's what he did. And well, Mr. Roosevelt came into office, and he brought in all these little fellows from the little red schoolhouses all over the country, and all of them got their pockets just full of plans. And so Mr. Roosevelt had plans too, and he decided that the important thing is to do something. He shut down most of the banks before he'd gotten halfway down Pennsylvania Avenue the day he was sworn in. And when it came to prohibition, he said, I can solve that. He said, just give me 3 words. He says, let them drink. And he did. And in the first 2 weeks, he sold enough beer to pay $14 million back against the national debt. And if he'd had good beer, he'd have sold the whole, he'd paid the whole thing. But so I'm for Mr. Roosevelt. I believe that finally, it's like the railroad track. Some people say, oh, that's the wrong track, that's the right track. It doesn't matter really. If you just sit down on the track, the train will run over you. So you got to do something. you got to move. And that's his idea. So every morning he sends down the menu to Congress. Says, boys, here it is. This and this and this. Do this. And so far, it's worked pretty well. And I think even, in fact, I saw him not very long ago, Mr. Hoover. I think even Mr. Hoover is sympathetic, because he's not opposed to things going well in the country, despite what a lot of people think. He's a very human man, and he wants things to pick up, and I think we all hope they will. So,
on that note, I'm going to introduce who this really is. Before I do that, though, your question about asking if he ever met Mark Twain. Mark Twain will be here tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, and then at 1 o'clock they're going to meet. We'll have a conversation between Mark Twain and Will Rogers at 1 o'clock tomorrow. It should be an interesting experience since you haven't met him yet. I've done this once before, and I had Will Rogers and Mark Twain and Dorothy Parker on the stage together, and they didn't know what I was going to ask. And it's the most fun I've ever had on that stage. And we'll have that again tomorrow. But help us welcome an educator from Oklahoma, and he's a real professional, tours the whole country. This is Dr. Doug Watson.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And before he makes a comment of why he does this and how he does it, I do want to introduce his lovely wife who's here with us. We're so happy to have them here for about 3 days. And here's Kay Watson right here. Okay, Dr. Watson.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, this is my second time to come to the Popcorn Forum. We can't remember exactly when it was, 99 or 2000, and had a great time. So it's a delight for me to be back. In '99, I had been doing Will Rogers for a little over a year. Now I feel like I've been doing it for most of my life. But it's a lot of fun, continues to be fun for me to portray someone who is, as I joke with people in Oklahoma, Oklahoma's favorite son who never lived in Oklahoma. Because he moved to New York before we became a state and then moved from Oklahoma to California. But he still plays an important role in the hearts and the history of Oklahomans and Oklahoma. And what I've discovered in traveling around the country doing Rogers is that he is much beloved by people all over the country. As a lot of people, as happens with people who have that kind of following, and Will was at one point the most famous movie star in the country, probably one of the 2 or 3 most popular radio voices, a newspaper columnist who was read, appeared in over 600 papers every day. It's estimated when he died in 1935 that 7 out of every 10 Americans either heard him on the radio or read something he wrote every week. You can imagine what that would translate into today in terms of media coverage. So he was a much beloved figure all over the United States. And the catch is he died 72 years ago this coming summer. There are fewer and fewer people who remember him. And as I travel around the country, even 10 years after having begun to do this, I don't any longer have frequent people come to see me after the show and say, I remember seeing Will. Now I still occasionally have somebody who says, I remember when I heard the news about the airplane crash. But even that requires some years. And so the question becomes, I think, do we keep alive a character of this stature once the generation that remembers him is gone? And the only answer I have is I hope so, and I guess that's what I'm dedicating myself to do, in part, is to try to help him stay alive. And so in part I'm working for the Will Rogers Memorial Museums in Claremore and Oologah, doing school programs and trying to represent them in a number of venues around the country. So maybe there's some questions that Will couldn't answer because of time or place or whatever that some people have.
What do you admire most about Will Rogers?
What do I admire most about him?
Yeah.
I would say 2 things. One is his honesty. I guess maybe that's both of them, actually. He was a person of tremendous energy and I think a kind of genius, although he'd never finished high school. He did have a genius in terms of relationships, working with other people. But I think the honesty, I think he was, as far as I can tell from having done a good deal of research, he was as close to being in his real life, the genuine kind of figure that he was projected as being, as almost anybody that I've run across. We live in an era of historical reorganization and rethinking and all of that. And there have been some attempts, to look at Rogers' life and see if maybe there are some skeletons in the closet. For the most part, what people have found is what they thought was there in the beginning. And his joke about the parrot is just kind of a little microcosm, of maybe a good reminder to all of us, in an era when we could be on camera and never know it, or be recorded and never know it, that if you live honest, you don't have to worry too much about that. So, good advice, I think.
I never met a man I didn't like. I think that's one of the favorite things about Will Rogers. And I'm wondering if you could integrate your thoughts as you and your knowledge of Will Rogers and tell us what your advice would be for us.
How do you do that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a magic bullet. I think Will also said at one point, if you want to be a true civilization, you got to learn to respect the rights of others. And I think that's a first step. We have to learn to respect other people and their freedoms to say and do things that may or may not agree with us. Will never said he liked everybody well that he met, that he embraced everybody and agreed with everybody. But he did believe that there was good to be found in everyone, and he went looking for it. And he believed that if you look for it, you're more likely to find it than if you go with blinders or with a filter or with prejudices that are already built up. He knew something about prejudice. As a part Cherokee Indian, it's very likely that one of the reasons Betty didn't want to marry him in the beginning was because her friends pressured her not to marry an Indian. And although he did not live in a time of, maybe overt prejudice about that, so it was not always there. He was aware that there were certain things, certain people who saw him differently because of who he was and not measuring up. Part of his not measuring up was his language, his inability or seeming inability to speak with proper grammar or a sophisticated vocabulary. And he almost always played that to be a virtue. He would say, I write a column. One of my friends, O. McIntyre, writes a column. He says he uses more words than anybody I know. He advised me to get a dictionary. I got a dictionary, but it's kind of like a telephone book. I can't think of anybody that I want to call whose number I don't already know. So he said the dictionary, the Greeks have got a word for it, the dictionary's got a word for it, but the good thing about the English language is there's always a short word for it. There's my word for it. So I'll just use mine. The part of that is be genuine and be open. And past that, I think we have to just, be willing to let people be a little different from time to time. That's okay.
And this will be the last question. He has a luncheon to go to.
Oh, good.
How old were you when you died, and how did you die?
Betty, was that the question?
How old were you when you died, and how did you die?
Okay. Will was 55, and he did go on the plane trip with Wiley Post against Betty's wishes, pretty strongly against Betty's wishes. But Betty understood that when Will set his mind to do something, there really wasn't very much that she was going to be able to do to change that. And so he went with Wiley. They went, they flew this new plane that was it was an Orion plane with an Explorer wing that made it nose heavy. It had a heavier engine in it too. They went through Seattle. They didn't get the plane inspected in Seattle because Wiley knew it wouldn't pass inspection. And they flew on to Alaska. They flew around for 4 or 5 days. Will would send his column back by telegraph. And on the 15th of August, they were going to fly up to Barrow and then from there across to Russia, probably perhaps the next day. It was a little foggy. They were actually advised not to take off that day, but Wiley thought it'll be okay. And so they did. And they got lost in the fog, put the plane down on a body of water up at close to Barrow. Turns out they were only 15 miles away when they set the plane down. And there was a young Eskimo in the village next to the water who they asked about location, and he pointed them toward Barrow. And they backed the plane up, started to take off again, and according to the witness, probably got up about 250 or 300 feet, and the plane fell into the edge of the water, and both of them died on impact. The young boy ran the 15 miles to Barrow to report that a red and silver bird had fallen out of the sky, and almost immediately the telegraph wires sent the news back, and people began to realize, because they were following in the newspaper the news of the journey, that the crash had done what it had done. You could find almost any newspaper in the United States on the 16th or 17th of August and see on the headline something like Rogers and Post dead in Alaskan crash. That's simply how widely followed his activities were. So widely followed that one of the reasons they would not, they kept a secret whether he was going to go on the trip or not until the departure, because they feared that it would, paparazzi was not then what it is now, but they really didn't want to have to deal with the press, if possible. They wanted it to be a vacation. But he was 55.
On that note, let's once again thank Dr. Doug Watson.
Thank you.